Welcome to our channel. Today we have 3 spine-chilling true night shift horror stories that will keep you up at night. These stories come from the brave souls who work while the rest of the world sleeps, the ones who bear witness to the things that go bump in the night. Make sure to turn off the lights and get ready to be scared. The old factory stood silent, shrouded in darkness. Its towering structures loomed like ancient sentinels, guarding secrets long forgotten.
I began my routine patrol, the same path I had walked countless times before. I'd worked this shift countless times, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights my only companion. The rhythmic buzz was almost comforting in its consistency. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. A chill snaked down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms. It was as if the factory itself was alive, watching me. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the night's unusual stillness. The silence was almost deafening.
His heavy footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness of the factory floor, each step a reminder of his solitude. As he rounded the corner into the warehouse, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was quick, almost imperceptible.
I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sound was so loud I feared it might give me away. In the distance, near the loading docks, stood a figure. It was eerily still, as if waiting for something. It was tall and slender, almost skeletal. Its presence was both haunting and mesmerizing. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I aimed the beam towards the figure. The light wavered, casting eerie shadows.
The light cut through the darkness, momentarily illuminating. Nothing. The figure had vanished as if it had never been there. John blinked, his pulse quickening. He questioned his own senses, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him.
I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes scanning the shadows. Every corner seemed to hide a potential threat.
The air grew colder, a bone-chilling draft that seemed to seep into his very bones. John could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. It was a primal reaction, a warning from deep within.
The figure was back, closer this time. Its movements were deliberate, almost predatory. I could sense its eyes on me, cold and penetrating. It felt as though it could see right through me. I tried to rationalize, but fear began to grip me. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting.
Taking a shaky step back, John tried to focus on his training. He reminded himself to stay calm, to think clearly. He reached for his radio but hesitated. What would he even say? Would anyone believe him?
As I wrestled with my fear, the figure began to move again. Its glide was unnaturally smooth, almost as if it were floating. It glided towards me, silent and swift. The silence was more terrifying than any noise it could have made. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, plunging me into darkness. The sudden loss of light was disorienting.
Panic surged through him. His training seemed a distant memory, overshadowed by raw fear. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a stray pallet. The impact was jarring, knocking the wind out of him. He fell, crashing to the ground, then scrambled to his feet and ran. His only thought was to escape.
The pursuit felt endless. Every shadow seemed to reach out, trying to pull me back. Finally, I burst through the factory doors and into the night. The cold air was a harsh contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The safety of the vehicle felt like a sanctuary, a barrier against the unknown.
The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a strangely comforting rhythm in the quiet stillness of the hospital ward. It was a sound that many found reassuring, a sign that life continued, even in the darkest hours of the night. Sarah, a young nurse on her first night shift, made her rounds, her footsteps muffled by the linoleum floor. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound seem amplified.
I paused at room 302, a flicker of unease passing through me. The room had an unsettling aura, one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Mr. Henderson, the elderly patient who'd occupied the room, had passed away peacefully earlier that evening. He had been a kind man, always smiling despite his pain. The room should have been empty, yet the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, forgetting to close the door behind them.
Frowning, she pushed the door open, her pulse quickening slightly. The air inside felt different, colder, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Shadows danced on the walls, creating eerie shapes that seemed to move on their own. On the bed, propped up against the pillows, sat Mr. Henderson. His presence was unexpected, to say the least. He was pale, his skin an ashen gray, and his eyes were vacant and staring. It was a sight that sent chills down her spine.
I froze, my mind struggling to reconcile the impossible scene before me. How could he be here when I knew he was gone? I knew with absolute certainty that Mr. Henderson was gone. I had seen him taken away, his body lifeless. Yet here he was, as if risen from the dead. The very thought made my blood run cold. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I gripped the door frame for support. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in.
Gathering her courage, she took a hesitant step into the room. Each step felt like a journey, her heart pounding louder with every inch she moved forward.
"Mr. Henderson?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The words felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else.
The figure didn't respond. It just sat there, unmoving, like a statue carved from ice. It just sat there, unmoving. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all sound. As Sarah drew closer, she noticed something even more unsettling. The air around the figure seemed to shimmer, as if it were not entirely real. The steady beep of the heart monitor was gone. The room was silent, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing. The room was silent, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing. It was a silence that pressed down on her, heavy and oppressive.
Fear, cold and primal, tightened its grip on me. But I couldn't leave. Something held me there, a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a sense of duty. My hand trembled as I reached out and gently touched his arm. The contact was brief, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. His flesh was icy cold, sending a jolt through me. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I recoiled my hand as if burned. The shock of the cold was like a physical blow.
As she stared at the figure on the bed, a horrifying realization dawned on her. This was not the man she had known. This thing was not Mr. Henderson. It was something else entirely, something that wore his face like a mask. It was something else, a grotesque mockery of the kind old man she had cared for. The very sight of it made her stomach churn. The air grew colder, a bone-chilling draft emanating from the figure. It was as if the very essence of the room had changed.
Suddenly the figure turned its head, its vacant eyes locking onto mine. The movement was slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. In that moment, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a fear unlike anything I had ever experienced. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the call button on the wall. My fingers fumbled, desperate to summon help, but as my fingers brushed against the plastic, the figure spoke. The sound of its voice was like nails on a chalkboard.
"Don't leave," it rasped. Its voice a dry, crackling whisper. "Stay with me." The words were a command, not a request.
Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled, her feet barely touching the ground. She fled the room, her heart pounding in her ears. The sound was deafening, drowning out all other noise. She ran through the deserted corridors of the hospital, her mind racing. Every shadow seemed to hide a new terror. She didn't stop running until she reached the nurse's station. There she collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. She never told anyone what she saw that night. The memory was too horrifying to share. But she knew the truth, a truth that haunted her dreams long after she clocked out of her shift. Every night, the same nightmare replayed in her mind. The hospital held a dark secret, a chilling reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. It was a place where the line between life and death was not always clear.
Other fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the aisles of the convenience store. The hum was almost hypnotic, a constant reminder of the late hour and the isolation of the night shift. It was nearing 2 in the morning, the witching hour. The time when the world feels different, more surreal, and the shadows seem to move on their own. "Welcome in." The words felt almost ironic in the eerie silence of the store. Mark, a college student working the graveyard shift to pay his tuition, stifled a yawn. He had been at this job for months, and the late hours were starting to take their toll. He leaned against the counter, flipping through a magazine. The pages were filled with stories he had read a dozen times, but they were a welcome distraction from the monotony. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the night itself was alive, whispering secrets through the cracks in the windows. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of a customer. The sound was jarring in the quiet store, breaking the spell of the night. Mark looked up, his gaze falling on a man who had just stepped inside. There was something off about him, something that made Mark's instincts scream for attention. He was tall and imposing, his features obscured by the hood of his dark jacket. The way he moved was almost predatory, like a wolf stalking its prey. He clutched a backpack close to his chest, his eyes darting nervously around the store. It was clear he was looking for something, or perhaps someone. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond. His silence was more unsettling than any words he could have spoken. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on Mark. The intensity of his gaze was unnerving, like he was trying to see into Mark's soul. The hair on the back of Mark's neck prickled, a feeling of unease settling in his gut. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different.
"Just looking." The words were barely a whisper, but they carried a weight that made Mark's stomach churn. The man hesitated, then slowly shook his head. It was as if he was deciding whether or not to trust Mark. Just these." His voice was a low growl filled with an unspoken threat. He mumbled, his voice a low growl. It was clear he was trying to keep his emotions in check, but they were bubbling just beneath the surface. He shuffled down the aisle, his movements jerky and unnatural. It was as if he was fighting against some invisible force. Mark watched him go, his unease growing with each passing second. He knew he should do something, but he was frozen in place. The man moved with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the shelves as if searching for something specific. It was clear he had a plan, and Mark was part of it. He stopped at the back of the store, his gaze lingering on the rack of energy drinks. There was a hunger in his eyes, a desperation that made Mark's skin crawl. He grabbed one, then another, stuffing them into his backpack with a frantic energy. It was clear he was in a hurry, but why? He moved to the next aisle, grabbing bags of chips, candy bars, anything he could get his hands on. It was as if he was preparing for something big. Mark watched him, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should call the police, but he couldn't bring himself to move. This was it, the moment he'd heard about in countless late-night news reports. This was a robbery. But it felt like more than that, like something out of a nightmare. He reached under the counter, his fingers closing around the cold steel of the baseball bat he kept there for protection. It was a small comfort, but it was better than nothing. His hand trembled as he gripped the bat. He had never had to use it before, and he hoped tonight wouldn't be the first time. The man approached the counter, his arms laden with stolen goods. There was a wild look in his eyes, a look that made Mark's blood run cold. He dumped the items onto the counter, his chest heaving. It was clear he was running from something, but what?
Mark met his gaze for the first time and his heart skipped a beat. There was something in those eyes, something that spoke of fear and desperation. The man's eyes were wide and wild, his pupils dilated, his face slick with sweat. It was as if he was on the edge of a breakdown. He looked terrified, as if he were running from something. But what could be so terrifying that it would drive a man to this? Mark's finger hovered over the silent alarm button under the counter. He knew he should press it, but something held him back. He knew he should press it, but something held him back. It was as if he was waiting for a sign, something to tell him what to do. The man was clearly unhinged, unpredictable. Mark had to be careful. One wrong move could set him off. Mark decided to trust his gut. He had always been good at reading people, and something told him this man wasn't a killer. He rang up the items, his hands moving mechanically. It was as if he was on autopilot, his mind racing with possibilities. The man slammed a crumpled wad of cash onto the counter. It was more than enough to cover the cost of the items, but it felt like blood money. He snatched the plastic bag filled with stolen goods and bolted out of the store. The bell above the door jingled again, a mocking reminder of the night's events. Mark watched him go, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had survived the encounter, but he knew it would haunt him for a long time. He picked up the phone and dialed 911, his voice shaky as he reported the incident. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. As he hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something more than just a simple robbery. There was a story behind those wild eyes, a story he would never know. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. And remember, sometimes the scariest things happen when you least expect them. So the next time you find yourself alone in the dark, be careful, stay vigilant. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight. Sweet dreams.